Thank you everybody for coming. Tonight we have an honor to present you to Philip Duff, who is going to do this amazing patent pending class. Philip Duff is more than well known in the cocktail world, consulting and educating all around the world. He's also famous for opening a first Holland Speakeasy Bar, Door 74, and being a founder of All Duff's Traditional Geneva. And what else to say, Philip Duff?
Brilliant intro. Thanks, Nicola. Thanks, everybody, for coming along today. And what this is the Magnificent Seven, the 7 base cocktails. Now, there's lots of different models of how you categorize cocktails, and there's also a few different ways to look at the theory that pops up once you start thinking about how do you mix cocktails, because the only way or the only reason you categorize them is so that you could come up with new ones or understand the ones that are out there. A lot of the work was done by my dear friend Wayne Collins. We worked together in the late 2000s. He was living in the UK, I was living in Holland. We were both traveling around the world. And he developed a lot of the theory, and he actually gave this group of 7 drinks the title, the Magnificent Seven. So Wayne passed away last year, so this one is for you, mate. Got to give credit where credit's due. The most important dates in cocktail classification and mixology theory are these ones, starting with the world's first ever cocktail book, The Bartender's Companion, published by Jerry Thomas here in New York City in 1862, and then reprinted a couple of times, one of them after his death. Now, the book isn't really about theory of mixology or classification, but it does group cocktails together, and it gives you some idea that that was how you perceive them. There's quite a lot of punches in here. There's a lot of cocktails. We'll go into that classification in a moment. But what Thomas really did was travel around America, and indeed even to the UK, and steal other people's recipes. Like, he doesn't give credit to almost anybody else in the book. So if you didn't know, you'd think, my God, this Jerry Thomas guy is really clever. He really just copied a lot of other people's recipes. And then what happened? Other people copied him. The next book is really important. It's the first one that had an explicit theory of mixology in it. It's called The Fine Art of Mixing Drinks. And it was written by an expatriate English lawyer working here in New York on Wall Street. He was also, even by the standards of his time, a horrendous racist and quite wealthy. And he would travel the world, and he was into cocktails the way that other people would be into food. And that was very rare back then. So he wrote The Fine Art of Mixing Drinks in 1948. And there's lots of really interesting, quirky facts in there. He knew the head bartender of the Ritz in Paris and stuff like that. But most of all, he published the first real theory on mixology. So if you've ever heard what Nicola might know of as the IBA theory of cocktail mixing, where you've got a base, a modifier, and a coloring or flavoring agent, he came up with that. And it's a good theory, but it's not perfect. There's quite a lot of holes in it. I advise you to read the book, obviously. The next big date was actually my old friend, Gary Regan, who also here in New York City published The Joy of Mixology in 2003. And what he tried to create was sort of like a Dewey Decimal categorization system for cocktails with a whole load of new classifications based on the drink themselves. For instance, there was French-Italian cocktails, right, where you'd have some vermouth in them or some kind of a French aperitif. There was what he called duos and trios, where there was only 2 or 3 ingredients, and so on. Really interesting, groundbreaking stuff. And then I think everything chugged along a little bit until Dave Kaplan and Alex Day from Death & Company published the Cocktail Codex in 2018, which some of you will have seen around. It's an absolutely gorgeous book. And it says right inside here, there are only 6 cocktails, namely the old-fashioned, the martini, the daiquiri, the sidecar, the whiskey highball, and the flip. This is aimed at consumers, and they're not wrong. But I prefer the model I'm going to explain to you now because it's chronological, so you see the history of cocktail categories as they evolved, and it shows you how you can use that to create and twist cocktails better. So I wouldn't even teach this seminar necessarily to consumers. It's very much for professionals like yourselves. Now, most of you will have heard of the Mr. Potato Head school of mixology. We didn't have Mr. Potato Head when I was growing up. The only toys that we had were actual potatoes. But with Mr. Potato Head, you can take bits off, swap them out, stick them back on. And this is an easy way to create cocktails. So if you start with a Negroni, which is gin, Campari, and sweet vermouth, you realize it's something strong, something bitter, and a fortified botanical wine. So you can swap the gin for tequila or rum or Sotol or Pisco or anything you like. You can swap the Campari for something bitter too. Could be Jägermeister or Amaro Montenegro or Select Aperitivo. You can swap the vermouth for a Quinquina or a Brutto Americano or anything you like, really. You could swap it out for a really bitter liqueur. And you'll create a drink. And the more you keep doing this, you'll create something really new. So here is the Magnificent Seven. The punch, the milk punch, of which there's two types, the sling, the cocktail, the sour, the cobbler, and the most recent one, the highball. Bear in mind, the cocktail only shows up more than halfway through the list, which is amazing to most people. But the cocktail is, of course, a different thing. The one to rule them all is the punch. The punch originated when everybody in Europe, but especially the Dutch and then the English, thought that it would be absolutely brilliant to get in enormous big ships and go over to places like Asia and kill most of the local people and enslave the rest. So you could nick all their nice expensive spices like pepper and nutmeg and stuff. Back in the 1600s, nutmeg cost more per gram than gold. So it was a good business. And the problem with these long sea journeys was the water went bad. And then the beer went bad. And then the wine went bad. And distilled spirits weren't that common in Europe at the time. Most people didn't drink them. So instead, what they tried to do was create something that you could drink the whole journey. The journey could be almost a year, by the way. So they came up with punch. There's a lot of discriminatory stories about where punch comes from. Some say it comes from the Hindu word panch, meaning five. And that sounds good because you've got alcohol, sugar, water, citrus, and spice. Except some punches have 6 ingredients and some have 4. Nobody really knows. A convincing story is that it comes from a puncheon, which was a large barrel. And to this day, there are puncheon barrel sizes existing in the world. So you would store the punch in there, and that was it. And what it was, if you were making it at home, you made a big bowl of punch. Initially, there was no ice. By the 1800s, people were putting ice in it. You would make a big bowl, and you would stir it, and you would invite your mates around, and you would all stand around drinking glasses of punch until the bowl was empty, and then you would make another bowl, etc., etc. You had all the time in the world. You were showing off that you were a man, and unfortunately it was usually men, of leisure. And you would like each other's company, and you would talk, and the punch was about 14% ABV. You still got drunk, trust me, because you drank a lot of it. But what they were trying to do initially was simulate wine, right? They would be making punch out in places like East India and Indonesia in the colonies. And they would use local distillates like arak, the Indonesian rum that started with a red rice starter. The arak was invented when the Chinese came to Indonesia and they brought their distilling techniques with them, right? Arak was probably the world's first luxury spirit. Rack brandy, it was sometimes called as well. Rum, obviously, very common too. This was the Navy. Geneva, brandy, these were what you made punch with. Obviously, there are siblings. Punch could be hot or cold, depending on the temperature. And milk punch is a very close relative. But we're going to have a taste of that in a moment. We've got a little cocktail coming up. One of the most famous bartenders of the modern era is Dick Bradsell, an English guy who only died a couple of years ago. Most bartenders are lucky if they create one well-known cocktail. He created about half a dozen, including the espresso martini, the bramble, the wibble, and what we're going to have now, the Russian spring punch. When I still lived in England in the throes of its first cocktail revolution in the early 1990s, every cocktail bar in England made this drink. For some reason, it never jumped over the Atlantic very energetically here. We might be having the first ones in America here. Do you want to explain to us what brands and proportions you have in this, Nicola?
I pretty much use the original proportion, which we can share. It contains some bubbles as a finish. It contains raspberry liqueur. I use fresh raspberries and crème de mûre, which is kind of like blackberry liqueur, and then some crème de cassis. So it's kind of like a lot of French style liqueurs. And then it has some fresh lemon juice and vodka as a base. We use Haku, Japanese vodka.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much it. I'm gonna give you a serve.
I was originally a long cocktail over crushed ice, topped with a little bit of champagne. So this was a fancy cocktail back then. Now the next one, I only want to bring up because there's three things that are interesting about this. One, we know who invented the milk punch. That's very rare. It was a lady called Aphra Behn, somewhere around 1620 or 1630 in England. She was a businesswoman, a courtesan, a spy, an actor, and a playwright. It was written about her that she had created the first milk punch in England, in the world. And what she had created was the clarified milk punch that you're familiar with, where you get some dairy, full fat cream milk, something like that, and you curdle it with something like lemon juice. Then you strain out the curds, so you got this beautiful texture. Now everyone's nodding along, but 5 years ago, nobody was doing milk punches except Nico de Soto, right? This is an amazing thing because a milk punch is shelf stable. Imagine having a fresh flavored shelf stable drink in the 1600s in England when they didn't even have refrigeration. You could keep a milk punch in your cellar and it would get better. In fact, the famous writer Charles Dickens died, clearly, that was a long time ago, but when they inventoried his house, they found aging bottles of bottled clarified milk punch in his cellar. This was some pretty stunning stuff. Now, the confusion sets in. The second interesting thing is that there's clarified milk punch, and then there is milk punch, which is literally a kind of a punch made with milk. So think about Brandy Alexander's, and even to some degree a Ramos Gin Fizz, although clearly that's more of a fizz. In fact, do any of you know Eamon Rocky? Rocky's Botanical Liqueur? He actually started off calling it Rocky's Milk Punch because that's what it is. And he only changed the name because it got confusing to people because they thought there was milk in it, there's no milk, all that. But last year, he gave me a bottle from his warehouse and it was the first ever batch of Rocky's Milk Punch. So it was almost 3 years old and it was this really dark color. And I'm here to tell you, it tasted fucking amazing. So this is 1600s technology. There are siblings of the clarified milk punch like the posset and the syllabub, which is usually made with a bit more sugar and something like sherry. But of course, you all know milk punch because you've got it here, you use it as a base, you make your own one, right? So we can skip over that. The one that I would like everybody to try once in your life is Nico's Milk Punches at Mace Bar here in New York. So if you haven't gone already, go and check them out. So now onto one of the most complicated categories that there is. This first emerged as a sling somewhere in the 1800s, early 1800s in the USA. But you could walk into 4 or 5 different bars in a row and order a toddy in one, a sling in another, a sangaree in a third, a julep in a fourth, and a skin or a ricky in the fifth, and you would get exactly the same drink. Cocktails were evolving so rapidly in early America, and they didn't have WhatsApp groups or the internet, right? They didn't have really even the telephone. So everybody was making stuff up. There was a lot of newspapers back in the day, and if the journalists didn't have enough news to write about, they'd go down to the bar and they'd ask a bartender like Jerry Thomas. They'd say, "Hey, Professor Thomas, do you have a new cocktail?" And bartenders then knew how to deal with writers as well. He'd say, "Of course I do. I've got an amazing new cocktail called a skin." And the journalist would say, "Is that like a sling?" He'd say, "Nope, totally different. Not like a sling at all." And of course it was a sling. The interesting thing about a sling is that originally you could make it hot or cold. And a toddy, which is very similar to a sling, could be made hot or cold as well. So if you made a hot toddy cold, it was a sling. And if you made a sling hot, it was a hot toddy. These were confusing times. Sling is thought to have come from the German word schlingen, literally meaning to knock back. Right? Bear in mind, in this country, it came within something like 100 votes if the official language would be German. America used to be extremely German, indeed. Right? It was not at all unusual to have lots of German slang in there. And all it is alcohol, sugar, water, and spice. In his book, Professor Thomas said that the only difference between a toddy and a sling is that a sling is made cold and it's got a scrape of nutmeg on top, which is clearly balls. That's no difference at all, right? You would have had exactly the same thing. The famous sling is, of course, the Singapore sling. Now, there are reports of a Singapore sling in Singapore 20 years before the Raffles Hotel started talking about it. And we know that it was made with cherry brandy liqueur and not eau de vie Kirschwasser, because it was described as a pink drink for pale people, meaning all the Europeans who were expats over there in Singapore. The Raffles Hotel itself is not really a credible source of information about the drink because they lost the recipe and then they started inventing, kind of, what they said was the recipe again, starting about 30 or 40 years ago. This is very close to being a recipe that Dale DeGroff got out of the hotel about 30 years ago. Dale DeGroff is probably our greatest living bartender. But do you want to talk us through the choices you made on the recipe here, Nicola?
So, as Mr. Philip just said, in German that technically means to chug something. And first things for like with Kirsch, which is like fruit, German kind of like spirits or gin. But what distinct to me, kind of like Singapore thing, is the addition of fruit. They made it more fun, more tropical for the first time. And therefore to apply for guests, to increase tourism. So they had marketing in their mind. There are many recipes for Singapore swing. I use one that we made actually at one of my previous spots. It used to be called Huckleberry Bar. And it calls for like a couple dashes of Angostura and then ½ ounce of Benedictine, cane, lime, pineapple, cherry herring, curacao, and gin. So 7 ingredients plus seltzer. Here you are, the swing.
Incidentally, toddies very close to being slings, and toddies accounted for the rise in sales of blended Scotch in the late 1800s. Whiskey was invented by my people, the Irish, but the Scots were better at selling. They invented blended whiskey and they went out and sold it. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, whiskey was drunk almost exclusively as a toddy which is to say with sugar, water, and maybe a bit of spice. If you look at the old advertisements around that time, you would see importers advertising finest quality toddy whiskey. Ooh, this is a tasty beverage. And if you think about it, we're talking about gin, cherry herring, sugar lime, pineapple, Benedictine, Curacao. Some people put in grenadine. Each one of those falls into the category of alcohol, sugar, water, or spice. So we're still only up to the 1800s. And as I mentioned, we haven't got to the cocktail yet, but here we are. Now, this we can date to a specific day in 1806. Somebody wrote in to an upstate New York newspaper saying, "What is this cocktail that I hear of?" And the editor wrote back. The newspaper was called the Balance and Columbian Repository. They're published about an hour or two north of here. And the editor said, "It is a mixed drink consisting of alcohol, sugar, water, and bitters. It is vulgarly called a bittered sling." So the cocktail was building on the cocktails that came before, right? The crucial difference here is it's got bitters in it. And bitters are probably the oldest mixed drink that there is. How old? The first bitters brand that we know was founded in 1690 by a Dr. Stoughton in England. And Stoughton's bitters was a huge hit. You didn't drink them on their own. You drank them with water or wine or beer as a kind of a medicine. They were issued to soldiers as health rations, especially if the water wasn't clean where you were going. They were sold as patent medicines. And like a lot of things that you can get from a doctor, people began realizing that they're fun for recreation as well, because they were also very high in alcohol. The herbs and botanicals that are used to make them are very stable when you soak them in alcohol. So they retain their medical quality indefinitely. So unless you live next to a herb garden, you don't have access to them all year round. But if you stabilize the herbs and botanicals in alcohol, and the advantage is, of course, that it tastes nice. So this thing, the cocktail, no one knows where the name comes from either. The two best options are that it's named after the practice of gingering a horse. Does anybody know what that is? If you like horses, this is not a nice story. If you had a horse that you wanted to win a race, or maybe it was a bit old or tired, you would peel a bit of ginger and lift the horse's tail, and it would wake the horse up quite a bit, as you might imagine. The cocktail is a strong, powerful, although quite refined thing that would wake you up as well. So that was the idea, that it would wake you up just as much as that bit of ginger in a horse. Well, you know, exactly. Now, there's a very long history of this. In England, they had something called a purl, which was beer with bitters and spices, essentially a beer-based cocktail. So instead of alcohol, sugar, water, bitters, it was beer, sugar, water, bitters. Then, of course, there was the Purl Royale, which was sherry, that's wine with brandy, really, botanicals, and botanicals that include wormwood. So there's a history for this drink. It just all came together over here in America. It's thought the world's first cocktail party was actually in 1783. George Washington was, again, in upstate New York, in Tappan, and he was negotiating with the English, who had lost the war. There was about 60,000 English soldiers and their sympathizers in and around New York, and they all had to be able to get out safely because they had surrendered and all that. So he was negotiating, and one day he looked at his watch, it was about 6 o'clock, and he said, shall we retire for wine and bitters? Now, he wasn't necessarily referring to wine. Wine was used to refer to spirits back then as well, because people didn't really use the word spirits very much. And it was also, if you were a well-brought-up person, spirits were still seen as being a bit low class. So you'd say, shall we have some wine? And then pull out a bottle of whiskey. So he might have invented the world's first cocktail party. What we're going to have here is one of the oldest cocktails you can have. So alcohol, sugar, water, and bitters. Very simple. You've probably seen the definition on the t-shirts. Bartenders always like to improve on things. So pretty soon you had the improved cocktail, which was alcohol, sugar, water, and bitters, a bitter sling, with something fancy. Didn't really matter what it was. You would put in a little bit of some fancy European liqueur, maybe some maraschino, maybe some curacao, maybe even some absinthe. Didn't really matter. You could put it all in or just one of them. So we're going to have the improved Holland Gin cocktail, which I think some of you might have tried before. Nicola, have you... I think it's just a straight up standard recipe here, right?
Yes, I just did like... the trick with this recipe is call for 1/24 of an ounce, and that can be confusing. It's not a typo, it's actually 1 milliliter, which is a dash. Because like dash back in the day was kind of like a common way to write down the recipe, and no one can say actually what was the dash. Now we use 1 milliliter, so we use 3 dashes of absinthe, angostura, cane, and curacao with 2 ounces of single malt Old Duff Genever, which is traditional and how it was made back in the day.
Exactly. The siblings of this are very recognizable, the old-fashioned, and the cocktail became so popular now that it is used to describe any mixed drink, which is crazy because it wasn't even the most popular drink back then. If you would ask somebody back then what cocktail is still going to be popular in 100 years, they would have said a cobbler, which is also one of the Magnificent Seven, by the way. It just goes to show that you can't really predict the future. Cocktails mean something different in different cultures. I remember about 20 years ago, I was teaching at Disney in Orlando. I was doing a seminar for a load of the beverage managers, and the sales rep that had flown me over, he said, "Hey Phil, do you want to meet for a cocktail at 6 o'clock?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'd love that." And I came down at 6 o'clock thinking, I wonder what I'll have. Will it be a martini? Shall I have an old fashioned? And he was just drinking beer, because meeting for a cocktail literally just meant meeting to have a drink to him. I was heartbroken. I did actually have a cocktail. Let's just pause for a minute. We're now up to 1806. So we started in 1600 and we got to 1806. So we're almost halfway through. This is a very different animal to a punch or a sling. And it's because the quality of spirits has improved. You don't need to add as much of other stuff to this. You don't need citrus. It doesn't need as much water. Now you've got good quality rum, good quality Holland gin, good quality brandy, and you're just refining it slightly, trying to improve it, actually. This is a marvelous drink. So, on to a new era in cocktails. This was made possible by two things that had happened by the 1850s. One, the sailing ships and steamships were fast enough to get fruit to places like London and New York where they didn't normally grow, like lemons and limes. Second, there was enough wealthy people to pay for cocktails that you could really begin to cater for them, men as well as women, and you could make what I call here a yummy drink. All the drinks until now have been strong and strong tasting. The sour, combining alcohol, sugar, and citrus, is yummy. Now, you're all grizzled, old, burned out bartenders now, but you can probably remember falling in love with a sour made with fresh lemon or lime juice. Maybe you had a real daiquiri or a real whiskey sour or something like that. You tend to drink too many of them and then you get burned out on citrus, but consumers don't. The heart of a truly yummy drink, the drink where you order one and then you immediately want to have another one, is this formula. And this, of course, is the base for the fix and the fizz and the Collins, and indeed the cobbler and the long-forgotten cooler cocktail as well. It's where the Pisco Sour comes from, one of the finest drinks in the world. And it's also one of the reasons why cocktail culture fell out of fashion, right? After World War II, apart from the fact that many of the countries involved made the best spirits in the world, a lot of soldiers came home to the USA, and during a war, you developed lots of great new technology, especially food preservation, right? So we have World War II to thank for a lot of that. Right after World War II, what did you start to see? The first fake bottled lemon and lime juices and Collins mixes and sour mixes. And that helped to kill off proper cocktails just as much as the disco drink era of the 1970s, right? People forgot how good fresh lemon juice and fresh lime juice is. And they began to be seduced by the fake shitty stuff. And when we're in the second golden cocktail age, when this started off in the early 1990s in London, it was literally just a couple of guys, Dick Bradsell, and a guy who was hired in from America to be a consultant in London, Dale DeGroff, King Cocktail, and their training was to be, guys, we're going to use fresh lemon juice. We're going to use fresh lime juice. And everyone would go, fuck, like, how does that work? I used to give so many trainings back then, and I'd say, hey, so you should use fresh lemon juice in your cocktails. And I'd always get the question, yeah, I'd say, where do we get fresh lemon juice? I get that question all the time. Or where can we buy fresh lemon juice? And back then you couldn't, actually. And it makes the biggest difference. There are questions now about sustainability and whatnot, and shipping and all that, and I get it. But fresh juice cocktails, lemon juice, lime juice, grapefruit, all that, absolutely unparalleled. And the sour first became popular in the mid-1800s. It was being written about in Canada as well as here. We also have Canada to thank for the air quality in New York today, so thanks, Canada. Think about it, though. The sour, one way or another, was the most popular cocktail in the world for over 100 years. You would walk into any fancy cocktail bar in New York City during the Mad Men era and order a whiskey sour or a gin sour, and you would get a hell of a drink. The number one cocktail in the whole world is the margarita, which is technically a daisy, which is a sour that's got a liqueur in it, right? A margarita actually means daisy in English. So you cannot overstate the importance of this category and of its subcategories, the Collins and the daisy and the fix and the fizz and all that. So what we are going to have here is a drink that brilliantly was invented by a sales rep. My friend Lee Edwards, he works for Housel Pens, who import things like Dulan Vermouth and Cokie Vermouth, but also Burr in here. So what do we have here, Nicola?
So technically it's kind of like, this is the flagship of Old Duff. It's Holland Genever that you can just explain. It's kind of like not as malty as the single malt Genever. So it's more approachable. It's kind of in between gin and super malty traditional Genever. It's sour with this, and then it's topped with Birch, which is quinine-based vermouth.
Yeah, beer, B-Y-R-R-H, is essentially a quinquina, which is a quinine, or for Americans, quinine, heavy vermouth, right? It's got wormwood in it. It's just got quinine as well. There are plenty of vermouths that have quinine in it that don't call themselves quinquina, And that's just because vermouth is a fucking complicated category. You know, I don't know what to tell you. So this is normally served with egg white, New York style sour. And that would then be topped with red wine. That's a tradition that goes back over 100 years. And the first recipes for that New York sour actually showed up in Chicago. Again, cocktail history is weird because it's all written in bars by people who are drunk. Right? This one is using a bitter quinquina on top. And it actually works really well. He calls it a New Amsterdam sour because, of course, this city was once the Dutch colony of New Amsterdam, part of the bigger colony of New Netherland that stretched all the way down to Pennsylvania. Ooh, yeah, I haven't had that in a while. Very nice. We're almost there. We're up to number 6. And this is the one I mentioned earlier on. If you had asked Jerry Thomas or any of his contemporaries, Orsimus Willard or Harry Johnson, what cocktail is going to be popular? What cocktail is so good that it's going to be popular in 2023? They would all have said the same thing. They would have said, of course it's going to be a sherry cobbler. This was, without a doubt, the most popular cocktail in all of America from around 1830 right up to about 1900. Very simple drink. You can make it with any base, but it works best with a fortified wine like sherry or port or Madeira. And all it is that, sugar, berries, and fruit. The most important ingredient, however, is the cobbles, the ice. Has anyone here heard of Frederick Tudor? All right, I thought you were raising your hand there for a minute, just yawning. Don't worry, I get that in my trainings all the time. America invented ice. It didn't invent ice, there was always ice. It invented a way for everyone to cheaply and conveniently have ice in their bar or home. It was a guy from upstate New York called Frederick Tudor, and he would go to the lakes around Vermont and Maine, and they would be frozen. And he would also come to New York City and Boston, where he was from, and realize it was really hot in the summer. And you think, aha. So he worked out a way to harvest the ice, keep it in ice houses, but that wasn't the clever thing. He built a distribution network so you could get it into everyone's homes and bars. He was also a brilliant businessman, by the way. Whenever he expanded to a new city, he would go to the best bar in town and he'd do them a deal. He says, I'm going to give you free ice for a week. Free ice. Can you imagine, like summertime in New York or New Orleans or Boston, and you go in your favorite bar and they've got ice? You might not have ever seen ice. And by the way, it was crystal clear lake ice. Fuck. And at the end of the week, he'd come back and the bars would be like, oh my God, sales are through the roof. And he'd say, all right, so you can buy the ice now. Here's the price list. My advice, keep your prices the same. Don't put your prices up. Then your bar will always be full. He was a genius guy. There's a book about his life called The Frozen Water Trade. He exported ice in the late 1800s to London, Sydney, and Mumbai. You could buy Frederick Tudor ice in India. The dude is a genius. So this drink is mostly about the ice. The cobbles of ice. That's why it was called a cobbler. It's also what we call a sessionable cocktail, right? I'm not saying you can't get drunk on sherry cobblers, but you would have to drink a lot of sherry cobblers to get drunk, right? It's a very sessionable drink, about the same alcohol as a beer or a glass of wine. And it's also rather ostentatious. We're going to actually demonstrate the garnish here. So you basically piled it up with all the most baller fruit and mint and powdered sugar that you could find. So it would come out. There's stories of big busy bars in New York and Chicago and Boston with like vast forests of mint, you know, and buckets of crushed ice, and everybody drinking drinks that looked that most amazing. So we're going to have, do you want to explain the recipe that you're using?
I mean, I'm going to explain the cobbler in general. So, with the exception of pebble ice or crushed ice, it's kind of like that dirty pour where you want those kind of like peels and oils from lemon or lime when you want some like fruit. Is it seasonal fruit usually? Today it's very like fashionable to use pineapple in your cobbler. Of course, it's cherry heavy. And what we like to do in general to just like make the game more interesting is maybe half of an ounce of overproof Jamaican rum, like Smith & Cross. It's perfect match for like sherry, like Fino sherry in this case, or Amontillado or Oloroso, so any dry sherry. And that's pretty much it. It's kind of like forgotten and not popular drink today, but amazing, refreshing, and very pleasant one.
Beautiful. Is this the Sweet Liberty recipe that you're making?
This is exactly the one.
This is from my also dear departed friend, John Lemire. He opened a brilliant bar, still open in Miami, called Sweet Liberty. And he really liked this drink. So he just twisted it. It's based on Fino sherry. You don't want to go much sweeter than a Fino or an Amontillado in this, right? A Pedro Jimenez cobbler is going to be like almost like an after dinner drink. So Fino, grapefruit juice, honey, pineapple juice, and elderflower liqueur. So it stays within the precepts of the category more or less. But a cobbler is one of those things. You read a lot of old cocktail books and you think, well, that's nice, but that would never work these days. Well, the cobbler is one that where you can make the recipe one-on-one out of here, and it is an absolute solid gold drink. And just like a julep, the garnish is kind of the point. You're supposed to get your nose in there. The other thing that made the cobbler a killer drink was the straw. You didn't need straws before ice became common. And you definitely didn't need straws before crushed ice became common. So the cobbler made the straw. Some early straws were actually made from straw. For a while there, they made straws from glass, but that didn't work out very well, as you might be able to imagine, right? And it took them a while before they started making straws from plastic and stuff like that. But actually, straws were some of the most common ones back then. This is very refreshing because of the grapefruit. And finally, the seventh of seven, the and drink, the highball. Now, this first showed up in the 1800s in England, but it wasn't called a highball. What it was, they started to drink like Americans. Which means they were adding ice and soda water from a soda siphon. That was incredibly popular. And what they were drinking was scotch or brandy. So scotch and soda or brandy and soda. And being English, they called it scotch and soda or brandy and soda. They didn't have a name for it. It was called a highball in America. Again, nobody knows why. The idea was, one story is, when trains were going across America, they would have to stop to fill up their water tank, right? When the tank was full, there was a little measure on the tank, an arm with a ball on it. When the tank was full, the ball would float to the top, and the signal man would sound three things on the horn. It would be like short, short, long. So, and that meant the ball was high and the train was leaving. So the cocktail is 2 short shots and something to mix it up. Do you understand what I'm saying? Like a gin and tonic or a whiskey and coke, right? And that's it. Obviously, this is the biggest class of drink in the world. Whiskey and coke, rum and coke. The soda drinks are coming back. Vodka soda is the #1 drink in the USA, which is baffling. Ranch water, theoretically tequila soda with lime juice, is also on its way up. Do you guys get orders for that?
I had one like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah? It's not that common then, no? Not yet. One of the best vanished ones is actually a Presbyterian, which is rye whiskey with ginger ale. and a garnish, right? The Cuba Libre, rum, Coca-Cola, and lime, is one of those drinks. So the gin tonic has become, well, it has led the revolution of gin back to the top of the sales table in Europe and also in places like Ireland, Holland, Belgium, Japan, led by the massive glass full of ice, half full of gin, and then filled up with tonic and garnishes. My friend David Smith even wrote a whole book about them. This has never worked here. And I'll tell you why. It's because all the big drinks companies are afraid to promote this because you have to put in at least 3 ounces of gin. And they're terrified of being sued. That's really it. Everywhere else I mentioned, they're having a huge gin boom because they've got consumers to make these big, glorious, what they call gin tonicas. This started off in Spain because Spain was in a really big recession 20 years ago. And people could go out. They only had enough money for one drink. So the bartenders tried to make it as big and fancy as they could because people could only afford one drink. So the reason that it hasn't become a thing here in the USA is because the big drinks companies won't get behind it because everyone's afraid of being sued because there's so many lawyers in America. So what do we have here?
So we have Old Cuban, which is aged rum, mint leaves, a couple dashes of Angostura, sweet and sour, and topped with some champagne or some bubbles. And the only thing what they have to add about the highball, and what they love about that, it's kind of traditional Ricky. If you drink, for example, gin Ricky, it can be much more than just like splash of lime, gin, ice, soda water. So it doesn't call for anything sweet, but you can actually implement like lemon or lime oils while mixing it gently. And then you get actually like something unexpected but simple.
Brilliant. And this drink, the Old Cuban, was invented here in New York by Audrey Saunders, who was a protege of Dale DeGroff. Thank you. And founded the Pegu Club, one of the mainstays of the cocktail revolution here, that only closed its doors a couple of years ago. The Old Cuban might be her most famous cocktail that she invented. She actually invented it with smuggled Havana Club rum, but you can make it perfectly well with non-smuggled rum. Ooh, my word. That's a nice beverage. You can't talk about this category without discussing how the gin and tonic became gentrified. Until 1750, gin was what not just poor people, the poorest people drank. And then the government made it so that you had to buy alcohol to make gin in very large quantities. So they kind of forced ownership of the gin companies into big companies. And the big companies did everything on the up and up and became very big. That meant they paid more taxes to the king or queen, and that made gin more acceptable. They also issued gin to army officers serving in India. And the army officers were part of the aristocracy back then. If you were a rich dude, it was expected that you served in the army. It's very different to now. They, in India, were issued tonic water as an anti-malarial. And the quinine in tonic water, quinine is really bitter. I mean, really bitter. So tonic water is water, quinine, and sugar. Being English, they mixed this with the gin. So the gin and tonic became a very upmarket drink. So in less than 100 years, the whole image of gin was turned around with the help of England's invasion of India and the use of tonic water as an anti-malarial. So our last slide here is just a rundown of where it all fits together. When you see the Magnificent Seven, you can see how many similarities there are between them. And from this basic family tree stems every cocktail that has ever been made or will ever be made. And a solid understanding of the category lets you analyze drinks and create your own, whether by the Mr. Potato method or by creatively thinking to yourself, all right, well, spice. What does spice mean? So my friend Marion Becquet has created both a liqueur and a bitter based on buzz buttons, which are these electric spice plants from China. When you bite into them, you get a literal electrical sensation on your tongue. And he's reinvented that as spice, right? He says, well, I can use that as spice in a cocktail. And it's amazing. And he can infuse them into liquids. As I say, he made a bitters, he's made a liqueur. So thinking creatively about dairy. Apparently dairy doesn't only have to come from cows now. Somebody has worked out a way to milk various nuts. I don't know exactly how it goes, but you can have non-dairy dairy now, which is kind of impressive if you think about it. And of course, there's a million different interpretations and reinterpretations of what sugar actually is. That's something for another seminar. So if you have any questions about this or the reading list or anything else, you can always get in touch with me on Twitter, on Instagram. You can listen to the podcast on Spotify or Apple or all that kind of thing. And if you hit up the QR code there, you'll have all my contact details in your phone. You can email me or send me texts or stuff like that. And that's us. So what questions can I answer? There's always the awkward bit. Let's go back and sip the cocktail for a moment.
How do you see proteins in cocktails like egg white or even like aquafaba or?
That's a really good question. They're not there for flavor. Like when I started making cocktails with egg white, you're like, oh my God, but there was always a certain smell. So we learned to actually flavor the egg white, and then the smell would disappear. So if you flavor egg white with lemon peels and then you make a sour, you don't smell the egg anymore. And aquafaba is, I think, even better at that. But those I think are more like garnishes than anything else. You know, and there's things you can add to cocktails to stimulate mouthfeel, like glycerin. And that's more of an ingredient to me. Mouthfeel to me makes it an ingredient. Something purely visual is a garnish. Obviously, they all make up a cocktail. It's a great question. I wish I had a good answer. Anyone got a question about categories or mixology models? Because we could do like 45 minutes just on mixology models.
I do have a question. You listed the cobbler as a sibling of the sour and then put a cobbler in its own category. I'm not sure if that was only because of the addition of like the cobbler ice or if there's something else that makes those distinct, because the cobbler drinks and the sour drinks are really similar and sometimes even identical.
Yeah, if I'll just roll back there. So the sour, alcohol, sugar, citrus, with the addition possibly of egg white for things, and maybe with the cobbler, it's fortified wine, sugar, ice. It doesn't have a citrus content necessarily. And it's also interesting to include this as almost a forgotten drink, and also to give an opportunity to talk about ice. Because sours were popular before people commonly made drinks with ice.
So technically our strange magic, it's more cobbler than anything else because it has like strawberry infusion and it has Madeira dry wine instead of dry sherry. And then because it goes from fruits, people usually put lemon or lime veg, and that's how you get some sort of citrus or some sour fruit.
So basically before the cobbler and the ice came to the scene, you would make a sour just mixing it in a glass?
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah, so to divert into sours, obviously the elephant in the room is the daiquiri, right? And the mojito. And these in turn were descended from early drinks. There was one called the El Drakecito that was invented in Cuba, and it was actually named after Sir Francis Drake, the dragon, because he attacked Spanish ships in and around the Caribbean, trying to steal the silver that they had stolen from the local people. It was complicated shit. And on board, you really wanted to have something sour to combat scurvy. Scurvy was so bad. If you went from Spain or Portugal to the New World, let's say Mexico or Peru or something, and back, the trip could be 2 years. And the death rate was up to 80%, principally through scurvy. Now, human lives were cheap back then. However, you still needed a crew. Nobody cared if that sailor died, but you needed to have a sailor, and it was easier to keep the ones you had. So what they would tend to do was they would bring citrus with them on the way out. Everywhere they stopped, they'd plant the seeds because they knew in 6 months they'd be coming back and there might be fruit there. Right? So the sours existed before ice was used commonly at all. And that's why, incidentally, we got Curacao. Spanish sailors left. They planted orange seeds on the island of Curacao. And for whatever reason, nobody went to Curacao for decades. Because I don't know if you've ever been to Curacao, there's fuck all there, really, even now. And when they got back, the oranges had hybridized, because that's what citrus fruit do. They hybridize spontaneously. Grapefruits didn't exist until 160 years ago. Didn't exist. They spontaneously hybridized in the Caribbean. And it was these really tough, green-skinned oranges in the island of Curacao that only the goats were eating, right? It was a particular subspecies of orange called Curaciensis viensis. But somebody showed up there, it was a French guy actually, and he picked some of the oranges and took them back, and he found, because the peels were so thick, they had an unusual amount of oil in them. And from them, they made the liqueur we know now as Curacao. Just to return to finish off your point, and I know you have a question too. The cobbler was a baller drink. Of all the drinks here, it was the most ostentatious one, right? It was like the porn star martini, or like when you order a bottle of champagne in a nightclub and it comes out with sparklers and stuff. This was that drink. And it was also quite a unisex drink. It wasn't quite right for ladies to drink cocktails, but this was a sherry drink, so women could drink that too, right? It could be served in places like outdoor beer gardens. So that's, I think, why it kind of was worthy of inclusion, to see where things go. And of course, the fact that it was the ice drink. It was the killer app for ice, it was the killer app for straws, and it was a baller drink. But you had a question, I think.
So in cocktail history, even though we are incorporating a lot of ingredients that are being found through colonization, it seems to be deeply ingrained in Western culture. Is there a similar kind of cocktail or kind of experimentation of creating drinks in Eastern culture that mirrors this prior to like the later 1900s?
Like China?
China.
Aha. You should listen to the recent edition of my podcast where I interviewed Dr. Edward Slingerland. He is one of the world's leading sinologists and a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And he's written a book called Drunk, How We Sipped, Stumbled and Danced Our Way to Civilization. So this guy is a professor of Chinese history and philosophy. And throughout his entire career, his whole research keeps coming up with alcohol. So he finally wrote this book. And one thing to point out is distillation almost certainly was born in China. That's contrary to what most of you have heard. Most of you have heard that it was born in the Middle East and it went up through North Africa into Europe, which it did, but it didn't spontaneously happen in the Middle East, somewhere around Syria, right? It got there from China, because China is the world's oldest true civilization, the Middle Kingdom, right? And nobody knows exactly when it started off, distillation, but you can tell from records in, I'm getting off my expertise level here, but I believe it was the Tang Dynasty, around 700 AD, whatever that was, that there would always be big banquets in China. And you had to drink toasts. That was their equivalent of responsible drinking. You didn't drink unless it was a toast. So the toastmaster was a very important person. If he saw that everyone was getting drunk, he would slow things down. And if he saw that people weren't really relaxed or loose enough yet, he would have more toasts. And around the Tang Dynasty, I think, the cups began getting quite a bit smaller. So people clearly weren't drinking beer or wine anymore. They were drinking spirits. There are some isolated incidences of people mixing botanicals and other ingredients into beer and wine from indigenous communities, but it's so far back, it's hard to see if that was recreational or medicinal, right? The short answer is, because it's not documented, we don't know. I don't think we had like a lost Aztec civilization of people, sitting around the pyramids drinking cocktails, but we simply don't know. And because I don't speak Chinese, no one's done the research over there. Even Dr. Slingerland is probably the foremost expert on Chinese drinking, and he hasn't even seen as much. He's always approached it from the idea of its, relevance for social cohesion and philosophy and stuff like that. But the answer is we just have a dearth of knowledge on that topic. And until quite recently, we generally didn't drink distilled spirits. So it would have been wine and beer mixology too. Sorry I couldn't go further, but didn't even get my professorship.
I have a question. So you guys actually mentioned the garnishes earlier. So I know some of the bars kind of have a tendency of using the garnishes like that rabbit. For example, the garnish is just as an essential part of the cocktail. So let's say like for the old fashioned, the twist, or cobbler by itself actually having the fruit like as a garnish and part of it. So like, do you by any chance know when and why the garnishes actually became a thing to start with?
I would put a lot of the blame or credit at the door of the cobbler. The cobbler was a breakthrough drink. Like if we go back through the categories, we're going back in time. So the sour, like the idea you could have egg white, like, oh my God, that wasn't garnish though. Now a cocktail would be garnished. You read the Jerry Thomas and it's like, get a sliver of lemon, rub it round the edge, twist it over the top. That doesn't sound like a lot now, but a lemon was a really baller thing back then, right? That was their equivalent of going bananas with all this kind of thing. And the cocktails were very subtle and refined. If you have a Martinez cocktail and you don't zest the lemon, it's got a different, it's not as good a drink, to be brutally honest. So you can see wealth, consumption, availability of products changing with these. Like here, with the sling. The sling could be made with some very basic stuff. Sugar, water, spice, and alcohol. Make it hot, make it cold. Like for hot slings, you'd get a thing called a loggerhead, a big metal poker, and you'd stick it in the fire, and you'd wait until it's boiling hot, and then you'd stick it in your glass, and it would heat it up. And that's why, by the way, there's a phrase in England called being at loggerheads, right? If you drank too many slings, you could get into a fight and start fighting with an enormous red-hot poker called a loggerhead. But this had very little in the way of garnish. Milk punch had no garnish, as far as we know. And a punch, you might garnish it with a bit of fruit, but generally it wasn't garnished at all. Later in the life of punch, it got garnishes, but even by the time Charles Dickens in, 1793, something like that, he wrote an article by, let's say, almost 1800, and he said, when you go to the public house now, all the punch bowls are stacked up on a shelf, not being used. So punch had ceased to be a popular drink in London, its spiritual home, if you will, within 200 years of it being the drink. So I would say we can put a lot of the blame for garnish at the feet of the cobbler. And then subtlety came back with the highball. A rum and coke without a lime squeeze is a very different drink to one with. Even a Mamie Taylor whiskey and ginger and a horse's neck is a very different drink because of the garnish. And the skill of a bartender is reading a recipe, whether it's from 200 years ago or last week, and working out how important the garnish is or not. Like in a mint julep, it's maybe the most important thing. The olives in a martini, not really important at all. They're not giving off anything. They're not sharing anything. The same for the onions in a Gibson. But people are being very creative these days, so it's a good question to ask. Sweet. Anyone else?
Where do you see flip or hot buttered beer within these 7?
Oh, really good question. A flip is probably more of a sour, right? Although you could make a very good case for a flip being a punch, right? Because you've just put in egg or egg white, right? One of the most famous variations is, again, a New York drink from the famous Delmonico's. Delmonico's was the first, what we would call a restaurant in America, down in the financial district. And you might say, there was always restaurants. No. Everywhere else was an inn or a hotel. You went in, they were making 1 or 2 dishes, that was it. Everyone had the same thing, there was no choices. Delmonico's was set up by some Swiss brothers, and you came in, you had your own table, there was a menu, you could pick stuff, they actually cared about making nice food. This was a very famous thing, and the Delmonico's flip was one of those drinks. But yeah, flips are great. Anyone else? We good? Excellent. I can't keep up my fake smile much longer for the cameras. So. When you have a question, please get in touch. You know how to find me.
Thank you very much. This was an absolute pleasure and honor.
Thanks, Nicola. Always a pleasure.